Sometimes you just want to get the lowdown, really understand something without spending ages digging through information.
Yeah, totally. That's kind of the idea here.
And today we're doing one of those deep dives into, well, a really fascinating bit of American crime history, the Dixie Mafia.
We've pulled together quite a range of sources, actually, trying to unpack this group. They weren't always front page news.
Right, not like the New York families or Chicago outfit.
Exactly. But their impact, especially in the southern U.S., was definitely significant. We're talking about a network mainly of white Southerners really getting going in the late 1960s.
And it's not quite the story you might expect, is it? Some surprising elements.
For sure. Our mission here is really to pull out the key stuff, the really surprising bits that show how they worked and the kind of power they had.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then. Where did they actually come from? What was their turf?
Right. So the origins, most sources point to Biloxi, Mississippi, late 1960s.
Biloxi.
Yeah. And from there, they basically spread out all over the southeastern U.S.,
All over.
pretty much. And what's kind of interesting, maybe a bit unexpected, is how some link their roots way back, even to the Appalachian states.
Appalachian states, how far back are we talking?
Well, some suggest a line back to this sort of anti-federal feeling,
Yeah.
like Whiskey Rebellion times.
Wow, the Whiskey Rebellion. That's digging deep for context. Didn't see that coming.
Yeah, and adds a layer, right? Suggests it wasn't just, random crime popping up. There
Right.
would have been some deeper cultural threads, maybe.
So where were they most active then? Which states?
Primarily, you're looking at Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama. Those were the hotspots.
Okay. Any specific cities?
Uh-huh. Places like Birmingham, Baton Rouge, Hattiesburg, Corinth in Mississippi, Dallas, Atlanta. Key operational centers.
Big cities, mostly.
Mostly, yeah. But, and this is important, they were also working in more rural, kind of out-of-the-way areas, too.
Which probably helped them stay under the radar, I guess.
Exactly. Made them harder to track, harder to build a case against for a long time.
Okay, so they're spread out, sometimes in obscure places. But what held them together? Was it like a strict hierarchy? Like the Italian mafia we see in movies.
That's a really good question. And, no, that's one of the big differences.
Really? How so?
It was, well, really loosely structured,
Mhm.
very informal, actually. No set chain of command, no, capos and soldiers in the same way.
So who was in charge? How did that work?
It seems like it was pretty pragmatic. Basically, whoever was making the most money at the time. They were the de facto boss.
Seriously? Just based on earnings?
Yeah, seems that way. Power followed the cash flow.
That's different. But surely they had some rules, right? You can't run a criminal group with no rules.
Oh, absolutely. There was one rule. One massive, unbreakable rule.
Which was?
Thou shalt not snitch to the cops. Simple as that.
The code of silence.
Exactly. That was everything. It wasn't family ties, wasn't country of origin like La Cosa Nostra. It was that shared goal, make money, have power, and this absolute silence was the glue holding it all together.
Makes sense. And that silence probably let them get away with a lot.
No question.
Hmm.
And it allowed them to use, well, pretty much any means necessary. Bribery, influence, and, like we'll get into, a whole lot of violence.
Okay, so let's talk activities. What kind of crime are we actually talking about here? What were they into?
Oh, man. Pretty much everything under the sun, honestly.
Like?
Illegal gambling, definitely. Drug trafficking, prostitution, robbery, contract murder, arson, extortion, fraud, bootlegging back in the day, rum running, you name it.
Quite the portfolio.
Yeah, they were big movers of stolen goods, illegal booze, drugs, really facilitating that flow across the South.
And I gather they weren't shy about using violence, especially internally.
Not at all. They had a fearsome reputation for contract killings,
Yeah.
especially targeting for members.
People who talked. Or might talk.
Exactly. Anyone seen as a risk, anyone who might testify or cooperate with the law. During their peak years, say early 60s, maybe through the late 80s, dozens of people ended up dead, usually shot.
Grim stuff. Okay, so we mentioned Biloxi. Were there other key spots or central figures we should know about?
Definitely. Biloxi, specifically the Strip, really comes up again and again as their home base, their headquarters, sort of.
The Strip. Okay. And who was running things there?
The name you hear constantly is Mike Gillich Jr.
Gillich.
Right.
He wasn't officially the boss, maybe, but everyone knew.
Pretty much. Unofficial, but the de facto kingpin. Interesting guy, actually.
Yeah.
Croatian descent, came from basically nothing in Biloxi, built himself up into this wealthy entrepreneur along the strip.
What kind of businesses?
He owned motels, nightclubs, which often doubled as strip joints, gambling dens, even a bingo parlor.
A classic mix of legit-ish fronts and outright illegal stuff.
Textbook, yeah.
Yeah.
But what made him so central was the trust. Even these really tough, paranoid criminals seemed to trust Gillich.
Yeah, so.
One investigator called him the Dixie Mafia's post office and their banker. He was the guy they went through, the one who handled the money, connected people.
Wow. Okay, so Gillich is central. Who else? Any other big names?
Another name that pops up a lot is Kirksey McCord Nix Jr.
Nix. Okay.
He was kind of Gillich's protege, in a way. Got on law enforcement's radar pretty early, caught with illegal machine guns up in Arkansas.
Machine guns.
Okay? And he was linked to this woman, Wanda Jones, who ran a brothel, and her daughter, Cherie Lara. They get tangled up in some of the later nastier stuff.
Nasty stuff. Like what? Give me an example.
Well, Nix was heavily suspected in the murder of a gambler named Harry Bennett. Bennett was supposedly about to turn state's evidence.
Breaking the cardinal rule.
Exactly. And that killing is thought to have triggered a whole series of revenge killings across several states, like dominoes falling.
Good grief. What else was Nix linked to?
He was also a prime suspect in the attempted assassination of Sheriff Buford Pusser.
The walking tall guy.
That's the one. And the actual murder of Pusser's wife. He was eventually convicted, though, for murdering a grocery store owner down in New Orleans during a robbery.
This Nix sounds like a seriously dangerous operator. Any links to, like, bigger crime organizations outside the South?
Yeah, actually, around the time of one of those murders, Nix was apparently working with a guy named Darrell Ward.
Okay.
Ward was supposedly an associate of Sam Giancana.
The Chicago mob boss. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Ward was thought to control a lot of the organized crime in several southern states at the time. And the Dixie Mafia also had strong ties to another local group, the State Line Mob, run by Carl Douglas White.
So it wasn't just one isolated group. They were connected.
Definitely interconnected.
Yeah.
Lots of collaboration, shared interest.
It still seems kind of amazing they could operate so openly doing all this stuff. What was law enforcement doing? Or not doing?
That's maybe the most disturbing part of the whole story, and really crucial to understanding how they thrived. Well, first, they often operated in places where law enforcement was just stretched thin. Small southern communities, rural areas. Yeah. Up until the 90s, a lot of these local departments were seriously under-equipped, under-trained.
Didn't have the resources to fight back effectively.
Right. They often lacked the gear, the experience to handle major crime investigations, let alone something as complex as organized crime.
Mm.
But it gets worse.
Oh.
They didn't just operate where cops were weak. They actively infiltrated law enforcement, especially in poorer counties.
Infiltrate? You mean like bribery?
Bribery, yeah, but also patronage, influence peddling, getting their own people or people they controlled into positions, sheriffs, deputies.
Wait, they had their own guys wearing badges.
Absolutely. It was systemic in some places. There's an FBI report that basically called the corruption in Biloxi and Harrison County, Mississippi so bad
Yeah?
that in 1983, the feds designated the entire Harrison County Sheriff's Office a criminal enterprise.
The whole department. That's staggering.
It really is. It tells you the scale of the problem.
So what were these corrupt cops actually doing?
Oh, letting Dixie Mafia guys out of jail. Yeah. Protecting drug shipments, moving through their county, hiding fugitives.
Yes.
Shaking down local businesses.
Yeah.
Helping run prostitution rings. Even, in some cases, helping murder political rivals who got in the way.
Unbelievable. Just woven into the fabric of local power in some places.
Exactly. Deeply embedded.
Okay, so aside from the corruption and the violence, how did they manage the business side, the day-to-day stuff?
Well, they were pretty clever about fronts. Used a lot of seemingly legitimate small businesses, like junk shops, antique dealers.
Places that buy and sell used stuff.
Right. Perfect cover for moving stolen goods. And these businesses were often kind of transient, pop up, operate for a while, maybe attract some heat, then disappear and pop up somewhere else.
Smart. Keep moving. Stay hard to pin down.
And where do they get their members? A lot came straight out of prison.
Recruited inside?
Yeah, it seems like state and federal prisons were prime recruiting grounds. And having violent history wasn't a disadvantage.
It was probably a plus, right?
Generally, yeah. It's almost a prerequisite. They needed guys known for violence, especially for collecting debts from the gambling dens and strip clubs. Reputation mattered.
Okay, quick question about the name itself. Dixie Mafia. Did they call themselves that, or was it a media thing?
Good question. It seems like Dixie Mafia and Southern Mafia started being used, well, interchangeably, at least back in the early 90s.
So maybe not their own term initially.
Probably not. You even see writers talking about the Dixie Mafia working with the Italian Mafia down south. It gets a bit fuzzy sometimes whether they mean this specific Biloxi group or something broader.
Ah, so the term might just mean any big Southern crime group sometimes.
Exactly. It can be kind of a catch-all label for illegal outfits in the South, especially ones that maybe got some local cover because of, cultural factors or local politics.
Interesting, that cultural angle again. Now, speaking of labels, they've shown up in pop culture too, right?
They have, yeah. If you watch American TV, you might have seen them mentioned or depicted. Shows like Justified, Claws, The Righteous Gemstones, even Young Sheldon, believe it or not.
Young Sheldon. Seriously.
Yeah, usually the sort of regional bad guys. And they were a big antagonist faction in the video game Mafia the Third.
Right, with a fictional boss, Richie Doucet.
That's the one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the name and the idea of this Southern crime syndicate, it's definitely out there in the public mind, even if it's fictionalized.
Guess it taps into that fascination with regional crime, different from the usual suspect.
Absolutely. There's a certain, maybe dark intrigue about it.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together then. We've got origins in Biloxi, this loose money-driven structure.
Held together by that absolute code of silence.
Right. A huge range of crimes, key figures like Gillich and the very dangerous Nix,
Mhm.
and this truly shocking level of infiltration into local law enforcement.
Yeah, that corruption piece is maybe the most startling aspect. This sheer audacity of it, taking over whole departments.
It really paints a picture of a unique and pretty terrifying criminal force in the South.
It does, and that contrast, like you said, between the informal style and the actual deep influence they wielded, it's striking.
Definitely. It makes you think, doesn't it, about power, corruption, especially in those maybe overlooked communities. So here's something to chew on, maybe.
Hmm?
When you think about that cultural context, we mentioned the anti-government streak, maybe local loyalties. What does the whole Dixie Mafia story really tell us about crime and society in the American South? Is it just crime, or is it tangled up with something deeper?
That's a heavy question. Or maybe think about the pop culture stuff. How do those fictional takes, like in Mafia the Third or Justified, shape how we actually see these real-world groups? Does it make them seem more romantic, less real?
Good points. Lots to think about there. It shows how complex this history is, way beyond just gangsters and cops.
Absolutely. Definitely encourages you to maybe dig a bit deeper into organized crime history generally. You never know what other surprising stories are out there.